I'm Carole Taylor. On this edition of Journal, we take a closer look at one piece of our healthcare system that doesn't usually get much attention, even though we see them working on our streets all the time: paramedics. We do hear about doctor shortages, nurse shortages, but did you know we have a paramedic shortage? In rural and remote areas of the province alone, there are close to 400 vacancies. And of course, the problem's exacerbated when an emergency call comes in, but the ER is closed or on diversion. According to Mayor Goetz of Merritt, a paramedic, if available, must transport and accompany the patient maybe 100 kilometres to the nearest hospital for emergency care. Now that takes time, and it leaves the community vulnerable. Also, the province does not allow the service to pre-schedule overtime coverage in advance when there are known holes in the schedule, for vacations as an example. So a patchwork system, sometimes covered by firefighters, but often resulting in wait times that are just too long. So a few questions. What is a day in the life of a paramedic like? What training is required? And why aren't more people applying for these vacant positions? I can't help but worry about the constant stress that our overdose crisis has added to the job of being a paramedic. And just imagine reviving the same person over and over again with the same result. That must take a toll. To talk to some of these issues is Tait, spokesperson for the Ambulance Paramedics of BC, who are currently in negotiation with the government. What are the biggest issues and possible solutions? Back in a moment. This, of course, is not a negotiating table, but Ian, what I really wanted you to talk about is what life is like for a paramedic. This is a part of our healthcare system that I think we kind of just take for granted. So what's it like for a day for the paramedics?
Yeah, well, that's obviously a very tough one. So there's two sides to it. So to start on the not so great side, it's a significant amount of pressure. When I look at what our members do, from the dispatch and the 911 call takers to the ambulances being sent to going on scene, we essentially deal with people on sometimes their worst days of their lives, right? When loved ones dies, when horrible accidents, whether it's in industry or at home, to long-term care, to the overdoses and toxic drug crisis. A lot of those things, we are the true front line. And I think a lot of times we've talked about being on the front line of healthcare, and paramedics really are that front line. Like, we are the ones on the street. We are in people's homes. We're at the accident scenes. We're at the industrial accidents. So it is hard. The stuff that we see on a regular basis, it stays with you, and a lot of times it can take a piece of you with it. And when we look at mental health of our paramedics and we look at the healthcare system, it's hard to see light sometimes. But with that being said, there's also incredible humanity that you get to see. So there's horrible, horrible aspects of human nature, of accidents, of disease that we see. But every once in a while, we help deliver a baby in the back of the ambulance or the side of the road, or we are there for someone in their last moments that, say, suffered from cancer, and we get to hold their hand and help them as they transition and pass away. We also get to see people that change their entire lives to look after a loved one, and we get to see these incredible examples of humanity that so far outweigh the negatives.
So how would you say the job of being a paramedic has changed in the last 10 years, 15 years?
So I'm in my 25th year now, and I've noticed a massive shift in what we do for work. So when I was, young and energetic, and the pager would go off, someone would call 911 for a medical emergency. You'd lights and sirens to their house, you'd help them, you'd treat them, and you'd take them to the hospital for a medical issue. Things have changed significantly pre-hospitally, and we're kind of a victim of our own success a little bit, because so many new medications and medical treatments, we don't see as many issues with disease in the public. So like a prime example is heart failure and even asthma. We don't see people having major asthma attacks in public anymore because people have puffers, they have medications, like they're very well controlled. A lot of cardiovascular disease, when you look at bypasses and transplants and, valve surgeries, these people live very comfortable lives post major event where we don't have to intervene on a weekly basis. The issue is with a lot of that is the rise of people struggling with mental health and addiction has become a massive part of our work.
And so would you say, let's say, since decriminalization and safe supply, that you are seeing more of that kind of overdose issue at your ambulance door?
So decriminalization hasn't changed our work so much. So the only way that we see that is, it used to be when someone overdosed or there was drugs involved, the police would attend. And there would be an issue there. So decriminalization, just from how I see it, is it's no longer a crime issue, it's a health issue, which is how we believe it should be treated. I think what people get confused a lot of is harm reduction versus decriminalization. So harm reduction is a massive project, and everybody has their ideas on how to go about harm reduction. I don't think it's easy to get wins with harm reduction because it's hard to say unequivocally what's working. But if you take it at something at face value, like say Narcan, I think everybody can agree that like naloxone treatment and Narcan kits have saved thousands and thousands of lives. But have some of the other things helped, like safe use stuff, like we talk about, the vending machines that have pipes and safe supply stuff. I think that has helped, but to what extent is really hard to justify.
So in terms of your numbers, are you seeing more overdoses?
Overdoses have become just a regular part of our work. That's how big the issue is when we don't really categorize it as, are we seeing more and more? It skyrocketed and took over our work years ago. So it's at the point now where, we're in our 10th year of the opioid crisis, but it was going on years before it was officially recognized as a crisis. So what we are seeing is, back in the old days, the downtown east side, certain areas of Surrey, bigger municipalities had little tiny downtown east sides. What we're noticing now is that addiction and toxic drugs is in every community. Every community is having issues with that. We look at encampments, we look at people that are unhoused. It is so much bigger of a problem now than anybody recognizes. And
so time and again, you revive somebody, often the same person. How does that affect a paramedic's mental health?
Yeah, so what I see is, when we talk about job satisfaction, and I think there's been multiple studies about this, and you think about why do people do what they do and what makes people feel good about their workplace. And we often tell the jokes like, it's not getting a pizza party, it's not a pool table or a ping pong table at the office building. A lot of people, and especially in healthcare, they want to feel like what they do helps and what they do is making a difference. From my point of view, I've noticed from our members, it's very hard to feel like we're making a difference with the opioid crisis because the numbers have not really started to level off or to go down. We are seeing some interesting trends just recently, but it's been 10 years where we haven't really seen it wrapping up. So I know a lot of my members talk to us and say, hey, it's harder and harder to feel like we're making a difference here. We revive somebody and they leave, like, because not all of them go to the hospital, and we'll either see them later or they'll be right back in the same area and we'll pass them with the stretcher to the next person. So the repetitive nature of addiction is very hard on healthcare workers.
And so let's talk about their mental health. How do they cope?
Well, this is something that I don't know how well we're doing with that. I know our union is investing significant resources into it, and to their credit, the government and the ambulance service is as well. 2025 was, like a precedent-setting year for paramedics. I know we lost 5 members that died by suicide. That is an unheard of number in British Columbia for us. We consider that to be a crisis. We established that in late summer, early fall, that, hey, we recognize this is an absolute crisis in our workplace. These numbers have never been heard from. Obviously, everybody has their own personal story and their journey, why, but when you have 5 paramedics that died by suicide, it's hard to think that those jobs and what they suffered from the job didn't have a role to play.
And so what do you do about that?
Well, resources is the biggest thing, and we've come a really long way in the last 10 years. When I was a young paramedic, you would never raise your hand and say that you had PTSD. It was like a stigma. You would never say that you're not okay. I think there still is, unfortunately, a demographic in our service that doesn't want to talk about that, and it's to their own detriment. So we've come a long way with support services, and there are some gaps there. Like we want our members to be able to pick up a phone when they're not okay and talk to a psychologist and get an assessment immediately. That currently isn't the case. There is a delay. We need these people to be able to go off work, to get treatment, to be able to get what they need so that they can return to work in a better mental capacity. And I don't know if we're quite there yet. And especially the numbers don't really show that. But at the same time, it's hard to force people to come forward. And I think some people that need it the most are the least likely to access those resources.
Well, one of the amazing comparisons you just made, Ian, was to talk about it like PTSD. And that's how you would describe, especially these cases who did suicide eventually. We're going to take a quick break and then come back and look at especially the rural areas and some of the issues there for paramedics. I do wonder, Ian, how the paramedics who are seeing terrible things time and time again, how do they actually adjust? Do they become cold, unfeeling? Is that their protection?
Well, we kind of have a joke that if you're ever at a party, you don't want paramedics telling stories. Like, it's one of those things where what we think is funny and how we adjust to things is not how normal people do.
Can you give me an example?
Well, when you just think of, I have seen a significant amount of death, like a significant amount. So, if you ask me opinions on an accident or how something has happened, I probably don't have, a party appropriate story to tell on something like that. So when you see those types of things, and, when you talk about military people, healthcare workers, people that work in prisons, RCMP, police, even our partners in the fire department, you see things that stick with you, and I can tell 100 stories from car accidents to, children that have died prematurely or, horrible things that have happened. But, you have to have a way of compartmentalizing that, and you have to have ways to disconnect or it will literally eat you alive.
And so you think it's possible to stay compassionate and do the job?
I think if you can't stay compassionate, that is a good sign that you need assistance, or that it might be time to rethink your career or what you do in the ambulance service. So there's lots of different areas other than just frontline ambulance. And I've had discussions with dozens of my colleagues about, I think it's time for me to maybe get into education or maybe get into dispatch or some other area other than frontline ambulance work.
I've heard very many stories from mayors, especially around BC, who are, like, in a way, they're front lines, right? So they see what's happening in their community. And, they say sometimes they don't have a paramedic available, or maybe the ER's closed again unexpectedly. How is that affecting your numbers in rural areas?
Yeah, we've had lots of discussions with municipal leaders. This is a big issue in British Columbia because you have rural, remote, Indigenous communities where, they just can't attract workers. And it shows in ER closures and nurses. It's the same thing. So, whenever we have a conference or we talk to municipal leaders, they ask us like, what can we do? And unfortunately, I think the issue is that these municipalities need to come up with a strategy to attract people to move there. So if I had a young family, I'd be very hesitant to take a full-time paramedic job in a small community that, say, doesn't have an ice rink or a pool, because I know like those types of things are what my kids are going to want. Like, is there a soccer field? Is there a hockey rink? So when we see a lot of these small communities, what they're struggling for is they struggle to come up with a community plan to attract people. So it used to be small town living was something a lot of our paramedics did in retirement when their kids have moved out. They've sold their home in the greater Vancouver area for a lot of money. They buy a beautiful house on a lake in a small community. Now, like young families, they want more of a work-life balance. And I think this is the same thing with doctors and nurses. Why you can't find them to move to small municipalities is because their families want resources, and so many of these small places, they just can't offer it.
And so you've got almost 400 vacancies in the rural, remote areas that you're talking about.
More, and they're all full-time living wage jobs with good benefits. So one of our issues is, we've worked collaboratively with the government and the ambulance service to try to recruit more paramedics. They did a national and an international, recruiting strategy. I don't think it's been successful at all to attract people here because, quite frankly, British Columbia has an affordability crisis. So if you can work as a paramedic in Newfoundland for similar wages or in Saskatchewan for similar wages, it's a very hard sell to get people to come to British Columbia. We have the most beautiful province in the world, but the reason why the affordability is so crazy here is because it's also very well sought after. So trying to attract people here for a better life sounds really great, but I don't know if the wages really make it worthwhile.
And how are you affected by these intermittent ER closures or diversions?
So effectively, the ambulance service becomes the healthcare system in those communities. And we're very nervous about that because it's just not a sustainable environment. I guess part of me thinks, man, thank goodness we have the ambulance service in place now, because if we didn't have that community would be in real trouble. The issue we have is, if we're not fully staffed, so say one of these communities is supposed to have 2 ambulances and there's only 1 staffed, which is very common, we go to the parking lot, pick up somebody with a heart attack, and if the hospital's 2 or 3 hours away, that's a 6-7 hour return where there's no ambulance in that community. So it's the second call or the third call that makes us very nervous.
And what do you do about that?
So we try to cross-cover, and like this is a BC EHS policy thing where we try to cross-cover communities, but there is a significant amount of robbing Peter to pay Paul, because if the next community over only has 1 ambulance, what do? They sit halfway, and then you kind of play the numbers on where do we think the next call's coming from. So it's a very big gamble. But we've made it clear, just from our point of view, like we need multiple resources in these communities because you just can't gamble like that for too long before you lose.
And so from your point of view, what do you do about the training? Because how much training do they have to be the top paramedic?
So this has been a big issue. In our last contract, we adjusted some of this stuff. So it used to be, you could start with a first aid ticket and you can get your first level, what they call EMR, so emergency medical responder. Basic level, you can drive an ambulance, you can assist with medications, and it's a very, very basic level. Primary care paramedic is the main bar that you have to work pretty much everywhere in BC. And then there's advanced care, critical care, and a couple others. So we are hiring a lot of non-qualified people, driver-onlys, that don't have any medical license, but they can drive an ambulance. And then hopefully the partner will have medical training. So that's how bad the staffing is, that they've lowered the requirement. Now in EMR, great place to start. It's a 3-week, 4-week course. You can get into the ambulance service, and then depending on what position you take, the employer will pay for your training to become a primary care paramedic. The problem with the primary care program is they just extended it to make it a very accredited system. So it can be well over, a year to 18 months for that training to take place. So when you have dozens of paramedics that are now in the training, well, they're not at work. So it makes it even harder.
And so one of the things that I know you've talked about is the fact that the province has changed the way you can do advance booking, like whether it's for vacations or something. You know that there's going to be a hole in 3 weeks. And you used to be able to book that ahead of time, and you can't now?
So last January, out of the blue, they came up with a new scheduling process. So we brought that to the media pretty quick, and that was resolved. But we've said to them, the province effectively runs on overtime and paramedics working on holidays. So we said to them, you putting in stipulations to stop paramedics from putting in availability is not helping. So say if I want to work in February, I would put my availability in mid-January and say, I can work these days, feel free to schedule me. Because when you pick up a shift a month in advance, you already kind of book that in your calendar that I'm going to work these days. It's harder and harder to get people to pick up shifts for a night shift on Friday night at 3 p.m. So it's not successful. So we told them, you shouldn't stop people from pre-booking overtime because it's not going to help with staffing. And it was overturned.
And so that's working better now?
Yeah, I think, like I said, I'm not too sure what the game plan was on that adjustment, and it failed miserably and was reversed pretty quick.
Yes, because I can imagine if you're a paramedic sitting at home and it's 6 a.m. and the phone rings, and they're just desperately trying to cover a position.
Yeah, and it's frustrating when you know that position's been empty for 2 weeks. You know what I mean? And sometimes you would call them and say, hey, I see there's a spot on the schedule. Can you put me in there? Oh, we can't. We haven't got to that yet. And you're like, okay, like that happens all the time. So the scheduling department, they're in flux all the time. We're trying to help with ways to get that improved, but it is what it is.
Well, thank you for all of the paramedics in BC do, because I think we sometimes forget what an important part of our healthcare you guys are, and women. And so interesting to hear your stories. We'll all think about it a little bit more when we drive by another ambulance. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you.
Back in a sec. When we talk about our healthcare system, we must always remember it is a continuum of care, from the 911 call to the ambulance arrival, to the ER, possibly to hospital admission or surgery. All of the professionals along the way, including paramedics, have an important part to play in seeing we get good health care. Let me know your thoughts on YouTube. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.